Welcome to the College Parent Central. My name is Vicki Nelson, and I am here with one of my co-hosts, Elizabeth Hamblet, and we are here to talk about all sorts of things that have to do with being the parent of a college student, the parent of a student who's thinking about or getting ready for or applying to college, and sometimes even those students who are on the other end and beginning to step out. We like to cover everything. And today we are going to talk very specifically about some changes in vocabulary. Now, we want to focus today on changes in vocabulary because Lynn Abrahams and I have done several episodes on lingo, just the terminology, the college terminology that you need to know because it feels like a different language, this jargon that we all use. And so there are those episodes. We'll link to those in the show notes. We also have a glossary on the website of, I think we're at about 50 terms that you might want to know. There won't be a vocabulary test, but it might be helpful. But today we want to be a little bit more specifically in talking about some of those words, some of the vocabulary that changes between high school and college. And the idea for this episode actually came from an article that Elizabeth wrote on her website. And if you haven't discovered it, that's LD Advisory, and you should check it out if you have a student who needs accommodations, a student with learning differences. There's so much wisdom there. But it occurred to me that while the article that Elizabeth wrote was really about the changes in vocabulary for students with learning differences, it really applies to everybody. Some of these terms may apply, but the idea of making sure that you understand about changes in terms. So we're going to dig in and talk about those things in all kinds of different ways. Because if you aren't ready for a change in terminology, you may not be ready for some changing expectations as you move from high school to college. And that's really the key. It's not just about the words, but it's about what matters. So, oh, that was a long introduction. I'm sorry. So let's actually start by talking about changes generally, and then we'll get into some of those specific terms. So I'm going to let Elizabeth get a word in edgewise here. Elizabeth, talk a little bit about why these changes happen.
So that is sort of, the root of this is really the laws. So this is a very misunderstood part of this transition for students, as you said, and it's not just, and I use the word learning disabilities very specifically, not because I disagree with the term differences, but we are talking about legal protections. And so we're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act and also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So in addition to the learning disabilities and ADHD, which are my specialty, students with mental health disabilities, what's probably more obvious to people is students with physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, covers anybody who has a disability. But it's different laws or parts of the law as your students move from high school to college with a disability. So students who have an IEP in K-12 have that under more alphabet soup, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it only applies to K-12 schools. So once a student graduates from high school, or in the case of some students, they never complete a high school diploma, but they age out of that system, they no longer legally have an enforceable IEP. Now, students who age out and have more impactful disabilities move into, a field that I don't know anything about, developmental disabilities and things like that. But for students who are coming to college, that IEP has no legal bearing anymore. It is not enforceable at the college level. We are not subject to IDEA. Now, if students have a 504 plan, then people think, oh, well, gee, Elizabeth, You just said it's the same law, right? But K-12 schools are covered under Subpart D, and post-secondary schools are covered under Subpart E. And it is a vastly different set of mandates. And so it's a really important point to get right, because I have done professional development programs for teachers who've said that their district moves everybody from a 504 plan, I'm sorry, an IEP in high school to a 504 plan before they graduate, because the people running the district mistakenly believe that 504 plans are valid at college. And the same thing, they expire when students graduate. They're not legally enforceable. We are not bound to them. So that's it. And so, you said that, it's important to understand what and why. Um, as I said, Section 504, it was written first, so it has the majority of the specifics for colleges, for what they have to do and also what they don't have to do. And so when you look at the text, it is, much, much briefer than Section 504, Subpart D, and certainly briefer than IDEA. And, as to why that is the case, I have my own theory about, the politicians who wrote it, members of Congress, and perhaps understanding. I just saw a stat that said that I think in 2022, only 38% of the US population was attending college.
Mm,
And so college is not mandatory, right? It's an option for people,
right.
whereas K-12 education is not. So my only way of understanding it is perhaps, Congress did not see a reason to place as many demands on colleges as it did on K-12 schools, because not everybody goes, and you don't have to go to college if you don't want to. I've never seen an explanation for this. But anyway, and the ADA, because I was just working on a presentation, the word post-secondary only appears in the ADA twice.
Hmm.
And again, my understanding, and none of this, by the way, I should say, is legal or medical advice. Please see a qualified person for that. But, I've been doing this a long time. The ADA was written in 1990, I think, to sort of strengthen the protections for students, for individuals with disabilities across our population. And so, again, most of the guidance is in 504. So, with all of that out of the way, it means some real differences for students, but
Yeah.
also, and you and I, and Lynn and Sarah talk about this too, the expectations for college students are different than they are in K-12. We really expect students to be self-sufficient. We expect them to be self-determined and independent in their functioning. And maybe to the surprise of some parents of students with disabilities, we pretty much hold students with disabilities to the same expectations. The responsibilities that they have to take for themselves are the same. And so I think that that's why I wrote that post too, was to, kind of give you a sense of how, with those changes in the laws, there are changes in the way disability services does its job, and also just in what students are expected to take care of themselves.
So I think that's really an important distinction, that high school versus college expectation for students. And as I listen to you talk about the differences in the two laws, which I know this is not my field. I mean, I work with college students all the time, and many of them have disabilities and accommodations, but it's not my expertise. But it wasn't until I understood that there were these two different laws,
Mm-hmm.
one covering K through 12 and one covering college, that suddenly it made sense to me of where these differences are and why we shouldn't have that expectation that things will just carry over the way it does. So then I think, as I'm listening to you explain that, I think it's important too that parents understand, not sort of fall into that trap of thinking, well, either my student is going to be be able to carry over the program, the accommodations that they've had in high school, or they will have nothing. Um,
Oh,
that,
that's such an important point.
yeah.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up because occasionally, it doesn't happen as often as it used to, but occasionally somebody's gotten bad information
Hmm.
and been told that unless you have, what most people think of as a disability, you're blind, the student's deaf, the student uses a wheelchair or walker, unless they fall into that category, that there are no accommodations, and that is not true. And in fact, again, in combing over the definition of disability in both of these laws, it includes, learning, it includes thinking, it includes concentrating. So all of those things are covered as long as students are found eligible by their college. And that's one surprise to families is that just because a student has received accommodations in K-12 doesn't mean that the college has to find them eligible.
Yeah. Okay. So that moves us into actually getting a little bit specific in terms of talking about some of the shifts of terminology. And, just to start it off, because then I want you to talk about eligible, but, it occurred to me really so often as I talk to both you and Lynn, who have this expertise in the students who have disabilities, I find you saying things and I'm saying, yes, but that applies to all students. That applies to
Right.
all
Yeah,
students.
sure.
So this idea of different terms
Hmm.
and sort of pairing up with different expectations. One of the ones that I notice a lot of students when they come to college confuse is the idea of their high school principal and the college president.
Oh, interesting.
It
Huh.
really is
Okay.
fascinating to me
Yeah.
because they see those as the same because the president
Sure.
is sort of the top of the
Makes so much
the
sense.
pyramid in
Right.
college and the principal is in high school. So students will sometimes say, they're having a problem with a teacher or they think a grade was unfair or something and
Hmm.
they say, I'm going to go talk to the president. Or I've heard the college president say, I get these calls from parents who
Mm,
say, my students doesn't think this grade was fair. When actually, in our structure, that would be the dean or the provost or
right.
someone who's
Sure.
charged our academics. So that's really just a different term,
Hmm.
different person, top of the ladder there. But that confusion of the terms really puts a student at a disadvantage in understanding how the place works. So,
Yeah.
so then to get into some of the specific terms you were talking about, and you just mentioned they might not be eligible. So, could you talk about a little bit of the difference between being eligible, which is a college term, and
Mhm.
entitled, which I think is the K through 12?
Yeah, and so I just want to circle back to something that you
Yep.
you said, that it leaves students at a disadvantage.
Hmm.
So for, this whole episode was inspired by my blog. I have spent, the last, I think it's 15 years now writing blog posts, but also, now three editions of my book. Which is all about, these changes at the college level and how to prepare students for them most
Hmm.
often, because what I realize and what the research shows when we look at it, and again, I'm very focused here on students with disabilities,
Yeah.
is that because some students are not informed about the changes, they do not register for
Yeah.
accommodations when they get to college. And, accommodations are certainly not the only key to success, as the research also shows us, but it's one of them. But
Hmm.
it's been my passion over the last 15 years, trying to find ways to educate people. So I'm just going to take a moment and just plug Seven Steps to College Success, a pathway for students with disabilities, for people who really want to dive more deeply into, we're going to talk about some stuff today, but it'll have more context within the context of my book. So anyway,
And we'll
eligibility.
put that in the show notes.
Thank you. So, and it matters because to me, high school is, right, we call it college prep. and how can we properly plan and prepare if the assumption is, and it's an understandable assumption if you've never had access to other information, that things are going to go the same way that they did in K-12, that, this system will be in place and that your kids just show up and everything's ready to go for them. And that's just not the case. And so eligibility versus entitlement. So, it's not exactly a perfect comparison here, but student my understanding, again, not legal advice, of IDEA is, students are entitled to specialized instruction, specialized environments. Schools have to look for and identify students who might have a disability, assess them to see if they are, and then, if they are found eligible, do a huge range of things for them. They create plans for students and set goals and objectives, and they monitor and they report to parents on students' progress. Now, what's important is students, again, as I said, may have been found eligible, but that doesn't also entitle them to accommodations at college. So we're not necessarily questioning a student's disability diagnosis when they come to us. So people say, well, you said my student didn't have a disability, and that's not necessarily what it is. But the legal definition of disability includes the word substantial limitation that they have to impose. So a student may have mild ADHD. And when we look at the evidence of impairment in daily life activities, we may decide that we don't believe that they are substantially limited. And so it's just, most students are going to go to college and, find that they are found eligible. But I just like to raise the possibility to people that their students may not be found eligible at college, and to just alert them that they are not entitled to be found eligible and to receive accommodations just because they have a history of that previously. And so there's not much you can do about it as parents, except be aware that, for instance, some of the students who have been identified with a learning disability, because they have a substantial discrepancy between parts of their functioning. Perhaps their reading is relatively weaker than their verbal abilities, according to the testing. If the reading abilities still fall in the average range, there are colleges that may not find your student eligible because they don't believe that they are substantially limited as compared to the general population, which is how we are to assess those things. So that's just something to think about. Um, and there was another point I was going to make, and we'll see if it comes back.
It probably will.
Who knows?
So that to me, and tell me if I'm off on this, is, I was using the term learning differences at the beginning.
Yeah.
I'm never sure, what's what. So it sounds to me as though the student who perhaps has the substantial and limiting thing would be a learning disability. But a
Yes,
student who
for
has,
sure.
as you describe it, mild something, that would be more
Hmm.
of a learning difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
so, difference is a really positive term, and I don't want to
Yeah.
be seen as somebody who isn't trying to help build the self-esteem of these students. And I think it's a well-intentioned term, but I have also seen, reports where I think the psychologist, the clinician, has used it to describe what is only a difference and
Mhm.
not a disability.
Mhm.
And sometimes there is evidence of a disability, and they use it to be kind. They think it's a gentler term. And so, it's the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's not the Americans with Differences Act. And so I don't say this to diminish, the intent of it when it's used, to be more positive.
Mhm.
But the fact is, sometimes students do not have a disability. Oh, it did come back to me. Now, ADHD is one of those situations where we're all over the map, meaning my colleagues at the post-secondary level in disability services, as far as what we require in what's called documentation. So while we're throwing vocabulary around, documentation is a fancy word for the paperwork that your student will submit to us once they're in college and they have registered and they have a student ID number. When they register with the Disability Services Office, um, we will most likely ask them for documentation of their disability, which, for learning disabilities more obviously is um, often they'll require whatever was the most recent testing. For sensory disabilities, it might be a form for whoever, identified or treats them. Medical disabilities, the same thing. Mental health disabilities, again, we're looking for a professional to say, you are a student with a disability. This is how I have identified it. Here are what your functional limitations are. Now, ADHD can be diagnosed by a variety of professionals, including a pediatrician in a well visit. And so families may find that the school that their student wants to attend requires testing, which they've never needed before, like the kind that is given to students for learning disabilities. And the college is allowed to do that. And students who do not submit it we don't have to find them eligible for accommodations. And even the case with autism, depending upon what kinds of accommodations they are requesting, if they're academic, the college may look for objective documentation, meaning not just sort of qualitative reports about the effects of their autism on their social interactions and things, but they may be looking for evidence that they are actually substantially limited when it comes to academic skills.
So complicated. And so parents could parent
Oh, you
pa,
didn't think we were having a simple
pa,
conversation.
well, that's why we're having the conversation because it is so complicated, and anything we can do to try to help, unpack it a little bit for
Mhm.
parents is important. So then at that point, parents and students could request testing. They would have to do that on their own and then bring the test results to the
I'm
college.
so glad you reminded me that I forgot to say that. So once students graduate, and even if they are in K-12, the school does not have to test them simply because the K-12, the high school doesn't have to test them simply because they found out the college that they attend will
Okay.
require it. So that's again a legal quagmire I don't really want to get into, but also colleges are not required to test students
Right.
who present to them. So that is something to keep in mind. And on my website and on my YouTube channel, I have, a written post on the site and on my YouTube channel, a video of how to find documentation requirements on disability services sites.
Okay.
It's not usually that hard, but I realize some of these sites can be overwhelming, and so I'll try to help you,
Okay. So
narrow it.
we'll link to that one as
Yeah,
well. All right, I want to move on because there are
yeah.
a couple more that I think it really is important to talk about. So, what about the difference between what in high school might be called a student's plan? You mentioned a plan earlier,
Hmm.
versus in college a letter of accommodation.
Oh, yeah, this is really important. And actually, if you don't mind, I want to back us up to coordinator versus case
Okay.
manager because I mean, these
Yeah.
conversations sort of dovetail.
Yep.
So, um, in high school, your student has a case manager, and certainly when it comes to IEPs under IDEA, that case manager has a lot of responsibilities, right? So they are writing annual plans where they set goals and objectives. They identify who's going to provide these services. They have to report on progress to the parents. They liaise or stay in contact with teachers and, when necessary, administrators. So college coordinators don't have any such responsibilities. It is a very, very different kind of job. And be aware, you mentioned, that a president of the university is very different than a principal of a high school. Um, Now, what's interesting is a disability services coordinator might also be the only person and therefore also the director of their own one-person office. And so that's not the reason why they don't have the same responsibilities, but to kind of put this in context, it might be the Disability Services Director is the sole employee of that office and has a caseload of literally hundreds of students. Now, I was just looking at some data from a 2022 survey of my colleagues, and it said the average caseload was 135 students,
Wow.
but the range is quite wide. So, at the college level, the person that your student interacts with around their accommodations may be called a coordinator. Um, and so it might be an access coordinator, disability services coordinator. Now, there are places that call those folks case managers, but I do think that they just have much different responsibilities. So here's what case managers generally, with exceptions always possible, don't do. They do not set goals and objectives for your students. And this is where our other vocabulary comes in. So, high schools, as I said, have to write a plan with all of those details in them. What we provide instead is a notification or letter of accommodations. And so, to give you a sense of how different this is, um, your student actually has to initiate this whole process for contacting our office, registering. They can find that process online. It will be obvious. I hope, I should say. They're going to fill out a form because welcome to college. And your future adult world, you must fill out a form for absolutely everything, including for our office, right? And that form is going to ask your student lots of questions, including what accommodations are you requesting? Why do you think you need them? Why have you used them in the past? How are they helpful? Again, on my form, if you're already taking notes, Vicki, I'll add to that. There's a free resource that I offer that kind of helps students prepare for that questionnaire, and it's a good way to assess how much self-knowledge your student has. It's a Google form because it's disability accessible that way, and so but there's a link from my site. Um, and so if your student, and see all these words come around, right? If your student is found eligible, my colleagues do things a variety of different ways. A number of them have, commercial products, these programs where your student will get a notification from their coordinator saying, hey, yes, we've approved you. We've approved you for these things. Remember, they're also not entitled to the same accommodations just because we found them eligible. They have to, colleges get to determine which accommodations we think are supported by their documentation. And then the way some of my colleagues set this up, they log in and it says, here are all your accommodations, and students can select. I want Professor Nelson to know about all of my accommodations, and she clicks those boxes. Or I only want Professor Nelson to know about these accommodations, and then they send the notification. Or I don't even want Professor Nelson to know I have accommodations, and they don't have to send them. Sometimes our office sends students a PDF of a letter, and the student is responsible for forwarding it to their professor. And so, as you can see, none of this involves any plans. And the student plays a very important role in communicating with their professors that they have been approved. And so, we're not monitoring your students to see if they go to class, which becomes an issue in college when they are not literally locked in a building, and if caught in a hallway, will get sent back to class. We are not checking in with their professors to see how they're doing. We are not looking at their grades. Some offices don't have access to their grades. It's just not part of what, the school thinks we need for their privacy. We are not providing progress reports, certainly to parents, but not even to students. Students are back to the expectations, expected to know how they're doing. Now, I know that it's not true of you, Professor Nelson, but sometimes professors don't get around to their grading very quickly after collecting papers or
No,
exams.
never me. Never.
No, I wouldn't think so. But we aren't in a position to, for instance, make sure a professor grades your paper so you can see how you're doing. Students have to self-advocate for all of these things. They want to know how they're doing. They can check their grades in the portal. If the grades aren't in the portal, they can show up at office hours and say, "Hey, I was wondering when you might grade my paper."
Yeah.
But
Um,
we are
it,
not planning. I'm
yeah.
sorry,
Yeah,
and I
I mean,
hate.
just putting the responsibility on the students and students needing to be proactive for so many things. I mean, it's not
Mhm.
just students with learning disabilities, it's all students. And it's one of the things that I see as a professor in the classroom all the time, that I see students struggling to make that transition, struggling to understand that difference of you're not going to necessarily, so I do grade my papers and I
I know
will
you
I will
do.
post grades on the portal and students can see them. But I think there's for many of them still an expectation that if I'm in trouble, if
Right.
my grades are coming out to the average of it being kind of low, the professor will reach out to me. So as long as I
Mhm.
haven't heard anything from the professor telling me I better shape up, I
Yeah.
must be doing okay. So and that idea of, well, I wasn't told to come and see the professor in office hours, so I don't go to office hours. Those are just a couple of examples, but I think
Mhm.
that shift to self-advocacy, to being proactive, is a struggle for a lot of students, no matter where they are on any learning disability, learning difference, no issues at all.
Mhm.
It's a tough one.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's so interesting. I mean, when I was writing the book, there are some schools that have, I don't know what they call them, like alerts that go out perhaps after midterms. But what's so interesting about them is, at least as I understood them, and certain, like not at every college are the professors even required to use it.
mhm.
So the
Right.
idea that professors are looking after students in that way, some certainly are, but that's just their choice. But we are not looking after them either. If your student has a problem with the professor, if it's related to your accommodations, yes, that's where a case manager would that's their role to step in. But again, um, the student has to alert us that there's a problem.
Mhm.
They should not rely on professors to say to disability services, you guys approved an accommodation and here's why it can't work in my class. It's going to be the student's responsibility to come back to us and to do so in a timely manner so that we can take care of it. Sometimes people show a lot of flexibility with deadlines and you know, and especially administrative ones for students with disabilities, but they may not find that at the college level. And so I write for a journal that looks at Office for Civil Rights decisions as part of what they do when students complain about their college to OCR. And I've been astounded at sometimes a student, doesn't say anything about not having gotten a note taker or the professor not having given them the approved extended time until after the semester is over. And OCR will ask the college to address it moving forward, but they're not going to require the college to let the student have a do-over or make the professor adjust the grade.
Mhm.
This is the big leagues, and I know
Yeah.
students are only 18, and we know their prefrontal cortex is not going to be done for another 10 years or so. But I think sometimes because we've been flexible with students and adults have provided a lot of support, it can be hard to see the areas where they're going to need to really step up. And that's why this conversation is so important, because
Mhm.
knowing these things, parents at home can start to work on putting more responsibility on their students and stepping back slowly so that
Yeah.
they're accustomed to handling things. They have systems in place for meeting deadlines. They learn how to communicate with authority figures in an appropriate and for them effective way.
So that's a perfect transition into really what was going to be my next question, probably my last,
Mm.
sort of area that I think we want to touch on, and that is understanding now, perhaps, that that there are significant differences between high school and college in terms of what students are entitled to or eligible to, and the oversight, perhaps, that the disabilities office is or is not expected to give to students, and that so much more of this responsibility falls now on students' shoulders. Are there things that, and you just touched on some, but are there things that parents can be doing to help students get ready? Because not only will that help the student be ready, but as a parent, if I have some confidence that my student is ready, I'm going to worry less. So,
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah,
what
and
what can parents do to help
right.
students get ready for this shift?
I think, sort of just having a mindset of building their independence as much as possible. And that can take so many different forms. And I think we're going to hopefully get around to interviewing my friend Kelly Challen pretty
Mm.
soon, who is a transition specialist for students with disabilities, but has a lot of really helpful advice that, much more specific than I can provide probably about how to work on those skills. So, you know, it seems really obvious to people and facile, but are they getting themselves up for school in the morning? Are you constantly doing that for you? Are you rescuing them by showing up at the high school with the stuff that they forgot? Are you reminding them about upcoming things? Are you checking in with them about projects that they've told you are due? Are they, making their own doctor's appointments and figuring out their schedules by themselves? These are all things that are going to be necessary when they get to college. You said, well, the professor didn't tell me I had to come in. Some of your students are not going to class, so the professor is not even seeing them.
Yes.
And it's not there. And this is, when we talked about the expectations, right? We do expect them to go to class. And look, I'm not going to be a Pollyanna about it. Students over many, many years have said to me, professors don't take attendance. They don't care if you show up. If you're pretty confident about that, oh, okay. I mean, I don't know why you're there. You're spending the money or your parents' money to be there, but it isn't professor's job to email your student and say, "Hey, I noticed you haven't been in class." So when there is a challenge with your student and a teacher, are you the one who's calling? Are you coaching your student into how to send an email and an appropriate amount of time to wait? Or if they would rather talk in person, talking to them about social norms, about you don't just walk up to somebody at the start of class when they are trying to get themselves organized. You ask about, when is a convenient time for us to talk about this? And I laughed when you talked about going to the president. There's a scene in whatever the Facebook movie is called, The Social Network, where the twins get into the meeting with the Harvard president about their problem with Mark Zuckerberg, and he says, essentially, "What are you doing here? How did you even get an appointment?" And it's a scene that's really stuck with me, like understanding that there are systems in place and
Yeah.
you often have to start in a certain place and move your way through the process without
And,
jumping to the
and
end.
everything you've just mentioned in terms of preparing, applies to all students. This is
Yes,
what I'm always saying,
right.
all of those things about emails and social understandings
Mhm.
and, going to class and paying attention,
Yeah.
all of that stuff, making your own doctor's appointments and all are things that we have for years been recommending that, the more that you can do with your student in high school, they will
Hmm.
be ready and you will have the confidence in knowing they're ready. And actually, I will link in the show notes to our ebook on something 60 tips for using high school to prepare for college. So things that parents can do to help students get ready.
Hmm.
So they apply to everybody. A couple of quick sort of more specific questions. What about IEP meetings during high school and all? Should students be part of that?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm a little bit of a an outlier in this conversation because what's interesting is there isn't the right parallel at the college level for those meetings. And what I mean is,
Mhm.
and this is part of this differences conversation we're talking about, when students register with us, and they may have to have a one-on-one meeting as a part of that intake
Yeah,
process.
so I was
And
good. That was going to be another question. So
yeah,
you
so
can combine the answers.
I've got to add to our list, Vicki. I have an interview, a video on my YouTube channel where a colleague and friend, who's a disability services director, talked about those intake meetings and what kinds of questions he asks, what he thinks students should be asking him. It's not like a job interview where if your student says the wrong thing, they get
Mhm.
nothing. It's just an opportunity to, learn more about that student. Um, Let me see if I can figure out where we're going with that. Oh, so the IEP meetings. So what I find ironic is IDEA is all about individualization, and then we sort of make it like the only way to prepare students for this is to make them run their own IEP meetings. Now, you know, most teenagers would rather not sit in a room with a bunch of adults. And not to say that they shouldn't ever be taken out of their comfort zone, because college is all about being out of a comfort zone, right? But I think that what they need is an understanding of how they came to be identified as a student with a disability, what their strengths are, because that's really, really important. What is an accommodation for them? Because some of the research indicates in some places that they don't even realize that what's happening
Mhm.
for them is an accommodation, so that they can clearly identify those. Um, and so the IEP meeting can be one of several ways to start
Mhm.
preparing them for this stuff. I don't think they need to run their own meeting, as some people have suggested. Being present might not be a bad idea, but also, to understand what people are saying. But there is no parallel at the college level. And for parents, it's important for them to know, like, we're not going to have a bunch of meetings over your students' 4
Right,
years where we call all the professors in and say, and how is Elizabeth doing? Back to, if they want to know, they can check the portal, and if
right,
it's not there, they can go to office hours.
right.
So it's a whole new world. I mean, one thing you keep saying, and I have an addition to that, is that we want parents to feel confident that their students are independent and are ready. I really want students to feel that way.
Mhm.
And what always worries me, when I hear about a student getting a lot of supports, is that, sorry, that is a very crabby cat who decided to be in the middle of our conversation. Um, is that students recognize how much support they're getting for adults. And I worry that it undercuts their confidence.
Mhm.
When an adult is there at every moment to direct them and say, when tutors sit down and say, okay, here's what we're going to do, instead of, what do you have to do? Show me your planner. What plans do you have to meet this deadline? Then they're not building those skills. When parents, are not placing responsibilities, I mean, everything should be individualized, of course, but There are parents who don't require students to take on any responsibilities at home. Darling, you just focus on your academics and we'll take care of that. That's not building their capacity. Many students are capable of doing more than they are. If we require it, we give them some direction. I mean, it seems dumb, but knowing how to do your laundry. Um, and knowing that if you leave it in the machine, it will be moldy and damp and you'll have to wash it all over again. So um, I think looking at the expectations that they're setting for their own students, and parents love their students, and that's why they do all of this supporting of them. But looking to see where there are things that their students could learn to do, teaching them how, scaffolding this experience, and then letting go. It's not always going to be perfect. I also forget towels in the washing machine and have to
Yeah,
wash
I
them
was
over.
thinking, been there, done that.
Yeah. So I think too, when we are looking at our students and we want them to do well, and we're imagining this level of perfection that we should get them to. And that is gets in the way sometimes of parents letting go.
Yeah. And sometimes failure, maybe
Yes.
failure with a small f rather than a capital F,
Yes. Hmm.
builds that muscle and builds the
There's some
resilience
great
muscle.
books
So again,
about that.
everything you're talking about applies to every single student.
You
Um,
know, one thing I want to mention too, we were talking about deadlines and flexibility that people show for students. And I was thinking of a specific disability related example, but it's also true for other students. At some colleges, housing stocks are limited. And so students may ask for an accommodation in housing, which from, this is not part of my job, but from what I see in the conversations in my community, often students would like to have a room for themselves, a single
mhm,
room based on their disability. Um, if the college runs out of rooms that they can make available to students as a single, because a student missed the housing deadline, they are not going to necessarily kick a student out. Again, this is where we would think very hard about their eligibility for that accommodation, how substantial their limitation is, because there may be other students who also want the same thing, and whether that is something that we have to require, do. But we're not going to kick students out of their rooms because a student with a disability waited too long.
right.
If there's limited housing, it's not an entitlement to get on-campus housing. As a student with a disability, it may be considered depending on the severity of the disability. But our students in the general population who miss the housing deadline also don't get rooms.
Mhm. Yeah. So I'm trying to think, we've covered so much ground. I'm trying to think, okay, how do we kind of
Right.
sum this up at the end? I mean, I think I'm hearing, um, everything that parents can do to prepare students,
Sure.
so that both student and parent have some confidence that the student's going to be able to manage. And sometimes less is more, doing less, directing from the background rather
Hmm.
than right up, right up doing for, or, maybe you do with this. Instead of doing for the student, you move toward doing with the student, and
Yeah.
then you gradually move back and let them do it. The importance of self-advocacy, and
Hmm.
again, for all students, self-advocacy and being proactive, and not waiting for someone to come to you, because that's not always going to happen. Also, and I think you talked about this at the very beginning, that each institution may be slightly different in what they do and how they handle
Hmm.
things, and what they call things, and that names, but that accuracy and that awareness and that sensitivity toward terminology, which is where we started. This was a vocabulary uh, episode. Um, don't just assume. Ask
Yeah.
questions. try to clarify, make sure it's not that you're assuming this term means this
Mm,
when that term means that,
yeah.
and just encourage your student to ask lots of questions and to know that things in college for all students, and maybe especially for students with disabilities, are going to be different
Yeah,
with,
it
and that
requires
those
adjustment.
differences are connected to different expectations.
Hmm. And I think too, setting your own expectations at the right level for how they do in that first year, right? It is an adjustment for everybody, and your students are taking on so many different demands, and so kind of being clear-headed about what that first year might look like,
Yeah,
and not being disappointed if things are just
right.
not as strong as you're used to. It is the expression goes, at least academically, that college is not grade 13.
Mhm. And the students that I teach in their first year, and then I see them in their junior and their senior year, and it is amazing what,
Mm,
for most of them,
hmm.
especially if they are consciously working at learning the skills,
Yeah.
adapting, and moving from there, they will get there. They are very different in 4 years. I think sometimes it is helpful for parents who have seniors and they're worried about high school, I mean, worried about college, to think back to what their student was like in their freshman year of high school and where they are in their
That's a
senior
great
year of high
point.
school.
Wow.
And to
Yeah.
remember you've got another set of 4 years like that for your student to grow and change.
That
And
is,
so maybe that's a good
that's
place
real.
to end the episode is, to work at it, understand the differences, different expectations, but to recognize that college is a 4 year journey and your student
And
will
not
grow.
always, not
Yeah.
always just 4 years.
So we hope it's helpful. Thank you to everybody who has stuck with us to the end. If you have a student with learning disabilities, I know this episode was hugely helpful to you. If you have a student who does not have learning differences or learning disabilities, hopefully you can pull lots of this information that is helpful to every single student, no matter what. We're going to put lots of links in the show notes, so be sure you go and visit the show notes. And thanks so much for being with us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Vicki.